Good morning. I should say good day, Pastor Ken in Australia. Now,
Yeah.
Ken, lovely backdrop there. Ken, tell me, what are the books by your bedside at the moment? Now, I know that you are a great reader because you are an author as well. So tell us about the books you've chosen for us today.
Well, Jeannie, when you asked me to do this, I didn't know who the audience would be, what kind of books they like, whether they're really sort of deep theological books or life-related books. So I've chosen two, actually.
Great.
One I've just finished reading, and it's called Bullies and Saints.
Interesting
and it's by
title.
John Dickson, an Australian author. Quite an academic sort of book, and yet it's very readable. So I had no problem. It was kind of, quite easy to read and to digest. And look, the subtitle basically sums it up what it's about. It's an honest look at the good and evil of church history or Christian history. So would you like me to just give a summary of that book?
Yes, please.
Okay. The reason I was drawn to it is because, like all of us, Jeannie, I had questions. We all have questions. Even though we have faith, we have questions. In fact, faith really shines against the backdrop of our doubts, working through our doubts and our questions. And some of our questions, we get answers to, some we don't. And that's a part of the faith journey. We walk by faith and not by sight. We trust God when we cannot trace him sometimes. And, the Bible says the secret things belong to the Lord, but the things that are revealed belong to us. So some things God hasn't revealed, and we have to just trust him, trust his character, what we know of his nature. I'll give you an example. Suffering is a big subject, like coming to terms with it. If the big argument against the Christian church is, if God is a God of love, why does he allow so much suffering in the world? And you've got to kind of find a way to deal with that for yourself. And the way I deal with that, and it's not in any way, a total way of dealing with the problem of suffering. But Paul said, the sufferings of this world are not worthy to be compared with the glory that shall be revealed in us. So that's not trivializing suffering. It's just saying, in the big picture, it's suffering in this world is a drop in the bucket to what God has for us in eternity. So that's one way I have been able to deal with all the suffering that we see, in life day by day. But anyway, getting back to this book, one of the things I've struggled with, Jeannie, is just our, I guess I would use the word shameful past as a church, looking back over the centuries. I do know a little bit about church history. I've taught church history, and it's very checkered at the best. And there are a lot of I use the word shameful periods and episodes in church history, and we've been poorly represented in that respect. And that's what this book looks at. And the author, as I say, is an Australian guy called John Dickson, and he seeks to address this subject in a very honest way, so that, first of all, Christians will not live in denial, that we will not deny our past. I used to say, all those bad things that happened, like the Inquisitions and the Crusades, those people weren't really Christians. And we can try to generalize all the bad parts of history by saying, well, they didn't really know the Lord. But, it's not good enough, because many of them did. In fact, some of them are our heroes. Some of the reformers actually did some shameful things and went to war and put people to death and so on. And it's, how do you deal with all that stuff? So basically, the way he approaches it, he sets the plot by describing the uniqueness of Jesus's life and his teaching, that his main message was the unconditional love of God. Okay, so he refers to that as the beautiful melody of Christ. Then as he looks through the history of the church, he says some have, played that tune well and some have not. Some have danced to that tune and some have kind of just trashed it,
Yeah.
And so he goes through basically the whole of history, and he says this teaching of Jesus is unique. He compares it with a lot of the other cultures, like the Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans. None of them come anywhere near this great ethic of unconditional love. None of them talk that. Their great things that they champion were things like justice, wisdom, moderation, that kind of thing, you know. But love did not figure high with them, but it did in the Christian church. Now, he says, okay, even the Jews, you know, the Jews taught, do unto others as you would have them do to you, which is good, you know, treat others the way you want to be treated. And he calls that not the golden rule, but the silver rule, because it still hasn't come close to the golden rule, which is what Jesus taught, which is not only to do unto others as you would have them do to you, but to even love your enemies.
Yeah.
And those that have despitefully used you and hurt you, don't retaliate, don't seek revenge, bless them, forgive them, love them. Well, you know, and I know that it's not in us, you know, in our flesh draws no good thing. It's God. It's God's love. It's who God is. And it's his nature. And we walk by faith in the power of Jesus living in us. So basically, he goes through the history and gives a very broad sweep, but some wonderful examples of those who danced well to that tune, you know, and those who didn't. So he says, first of all, basically, he's addressing the Christians. He says, look, fess up, you know, we have not done this well many times in history, and we have to come to terms with that and say, well, this is what the church has done, this is what God's people have done, but it's not who God is. Okay. And then the second thing, he addresses the skeptics and say, but you've only chosen the bad parts of church history. You have to come to terms with the fact that there have been some real, what he calls saints, real good people who you've probably not even heard of, but these are the people that started hospitals, that started schools, that gave up all their wealth to feed the poor and to visit those in prison, to stand up for social injustices, to set the slaves free and champion those causes. And so you've got to acknowledge, if you're an honest person, that there are not only bullies in church history, but there are also saints. And I found that a very helpful book. As I say, it's quite even though it's written by a historian, an apologetic, really, apologist, sorry, I should say, and an academic, it's very readable. So this won't appeal to everyone. It's really kind of for those that more of a serious student of these kind of subjects, Bible school students maybe, those in ministry, or those that have got an interest in history and have got questions like I had. I think that will be a great help to them.
Yeah,
Bullies and Saints by John Dickson.
Thank you, Ken.
Okay.
And I think that sounds a really interesting book to read, and also a helpful book as well, Ken. And like you say, that will be good for the serious reader here as well. And it's good to get an honest book as well, because sometimes you find some books have flaws in them. So that is very helpful. And you've got
it is a very honest and transparent. Yep. Now, the other one is one of my books.
Great. Well, you are an author.
Never one to miss an opportunity, Jean. You probably can't see that because of the background.
No.
But it's called What's Eating You?
Oh.
And that's the short title. The long title is It's Not What You Eat That's Making You Sick, but What's Eating You.
Ooh.
Now, I have to say, first up, that I'm not saying that what we eat doesn't affect our health. Of course it does. And I'm a great advocate of, you know, as best as we can, without getting into bondage and, you know, being radical, that we look at our diet, and that's helpful. But here's the question. You can have a good diet, eat healthy, exercise well, and yet there's toxin churning you up inside because there are unresolved issues that are eating away at your very health. Now, that's a fact medically, because it's reckoned, you know, one doctor said that up to 70% of illness is psychosomatic. In other words, you know, the state of the mind is affecting the health of the body. And so that's what this book looks at. It's not what you eat that's making you sick, but what's eating you. And the whole point of the book is that life happens from the inside out. we often approach life from the outside in. You know, you take, for example, counseling. A lot of people try to deal with life externally, you know, behavior modification, we call it. That's not the way God deals with our problems. He approaches it from the angle of transformation, which is from the inside out.
Yeah.
So he takes truth, he writes it on the heart, and then the rest of our life comes into alignment with what's true about us, what we now perceive to be true. And so that's transformation. Now, that's the same with health. Health really happens from the inside out. A lot of people suffer poor health because of unresolved issues.
Yes. From
the past. So, you know, we start by talking about the word heart. What is the heart? And it's amazing if you actually take a Bible commentary and look up how many times the word heart is mentioned. You'd be surprised it is mentioned so much in the Bible. And yet a lot of people, when I ask them, well, what is the heart? You know, we're not talking about, of course, the organ that pumps blood around our bodies, but, you know, the heart, figuratively speaking. What is the heart? When God speaks about the heart, what is that? The way I understand it is it's like a storehouse, you know, out of the abundance of the heart, out of what we've got in our storehouse. You know, a good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth good things. An evil man out of the evil treasure brings forth evil things. So it's a storehouse. Now, it's different to the soul. Some people try to equate the two. It's not the soul. The soul, as we know, is made up of the will, the mind, and the emotions. All these things pass through the soul and are a product of the soul, but they also pass through the heart. But the heart retains some of those things. What does the heart retain? The things that have brought us greatest pleasure and the things that have brought us greatest pain. We tend to hold on to those and cherish those in our heart. And we live out of those things.
Yes.
So we yearn for the good things, and we kind of resent the bad things, but we harbor those things. So I look at some of the things that people are harboring that are not doing them any good physically. And for example, guilt. Guilt is psychologists call it the number one killer. Now, as Christians, we have the best message to deal with guilt, the forgiveness that comes through the blood of Jesus. And yet the amazing thing is that people that walk around with guilt most are often Christians, because we project guilt. We're still talking about sin, even though sin has been dealt with at the cross. You know, we seem to obsess over sin, and God doesn't want us to have a sin consciousness. He wants to have us to have a righteousness consciousness. That's who we are. We're righteous. And once we have that kind of consciousness, that's who we'll be. That's how we'll live. And so I talk about guilt and how God's way of dealing with that. Another big issue is unforgiveness. Now, we all get challenged with that. We all get hurt. We all get offended. And that plays out in different ways. Somebody described unforgiveness as like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die. You know?
Yeah.
Where unforgiveness doesn't hurt the other person that's offended us, it hurts us.
Exactly.
And, you know, so unforgiveness, if we hold on to that, it leads to resentment. Yes. Resentment is from a Latin word, satir, is to feel. Resent is to feel again and again and again. It's like watching a video of someone that's hurt us, you know, pressing stop, replay, and watching it again, stop, replay, watching it again, going over it and over it. That's resentment, feeling it over and over. And then that leads to bitterness, which is, you know, the Bible speaks about a root of bitterness by which others are defiled. So with bitterness, we can't even hold it in any longer. It flows out usually through our words. You know, we infect other people, we poison other people. So these things are real, and they're doing damage to our health if they're held on to long time. I talk about toxic relationships. You know, God has created us to have relationships, but sometimes relationships can be damaging, they can be hurtful, and a lot of people don't know how to deal with them, how to exit them if that's necessary. And so I talk about toxic relationships, talk about grief. Grief is another thing which we can hold on to too long. Now, grief is not just losing a loved one, but it's losing anything that's dear and precious to us. It could be like losing a job, or losing our health, or losing our finances in a disastrous way. That's grief. How do we go through that process? We need to grieve. It's a part of the process, but we don't want to get stuck in grief. We want to come out the other side, And so I talk about that. Jeannie, I also share a little bit about my own testimony when I talk about rejection, because I was, rejected big time, especially by my dad. It had quite a damaging effect upon me.
Yes, it would.
And I never really got free of it, even until I became a pastor, and I heard a sermon by a certain preacher that just set me free. I understood myself. I understood why I had these hang-ups, and why I found it difficult to have relationships and communicate, with confidence at times.
Yes,
and, so I talk about rejection. A lot of people suffer rejection, but there's a way to deal with that, and to really come out of that kind of mindset. There's other things like sexual abuse and worry and anxiety. Basically, what I'm talking about is these are the things that if they enter into our hearts and stay there, in the long term, they will do damage even to our health.
Sure.
So how do they get there? And what's God's way of dealing with them? That's the theme of that book, What's Eating You. And both these books, as I say, they're Australian, and you can get them online.
Wow.
Bullies and Saints by John Dickson. That's Dickson, John Dickson. And What's Eating You by yours truly.
Ken Legg. Well, I have to say, Ken, that sounds an amazing book that you have written, very honest and open there. And you are addressing those subjects that often aren't tackled, or like you say, people want answers to, like grief and unforgiveness and bitterness. And these are real things that need to be addressed.
Absolutely.
So I want to read this book. It sounds absolutely amazing. And I think this will set people free to be who they are meant to be as well when they read it. I think it will inspire them and challenge us to do something about issues that we might tackle in our own lives. So Ken, thank you for telling us about the books by your bedside today. Thank you very much, Ken.